Hey everyone, this is a continuation of the same recitation, but I'm splitting the videos up because in this portion we're going to be covering more complex API interactions. What are the other verbs? What is out there besides get? How do we work with a development API and a published, built, deployed API? I might not have time for that, but I'll be sure to cover it. Um, so, so far we've covered GET requests. But there's more we can do with APIs. The convention we're using for the APIs that we're dealing with is called REST. And REST follows this pattern that we like to call CRUD, which is that there's create, retrieve, update, and delete operations. And we do these on resources. So I had a build week project where we were creating an application that dealt with textbooks. And so there were resources that represented books, authors, publishers, comments, so on and so forth. And these can be interrelated. But the way we structure the API is we generally give each resource its own route. So if we look at my documentation for that API, we can see we have authors, books, reviews, subjects. So if I go into authors, the endpoint for this is API authors, and from here we can add authors, we can delete them, we can get all of them, we can get the ones we want by IDs, we can update them. Same with books, at books, reviews, at reviews, subjects, at subjects, so on and so forth. Get is the verb that we use to represent when we want to get data. That is our retrieve from the CRUD acronym. Post is creating data. So if I wanted to add a book or an author, I would post the API at that exact same endpoint. I wouldn't create like a URL that's like create book. No, we get to reuse this books, and if I want to add a book, then we do so at somewhere in this documentation where I have that URL. Oh, this is actually a typo. That ID shouldn't be there. It should just be at books, and we'd post this URL instead of getting from it. Same thing with put. Put is update. We put data, that means we're changing existing data. We post data when we're adding new data. And then there's also delete, which is going to let us delete those same resources. And then patch, which I'm going to ignore. Because it's not directly relevant to these kind of CRUD operations that we're going to be doing this week. So the idea is we now want to have more complex interactions with our API. Besides just reading data, we're going to want to give it new data, update existing data, and delete other data. And that's generally what we mean when you hear people talking about CRUD applications. You figure out your resources, your books, your authors, your whatever, you can add, update, delete, and get them. And that's generally enough to get your application working. Okay, so let's talk about how to actually do this. So I've pulled up the good old forms project because I've got different routes on it. And right now my state is all just kept inside of this application, but I've gone out and built a little backend that manages this for us. And I want to add this back into my application. So let's do that. I have my, I can get rid of that now. So I have my application running on port 4000. So that's what I'm going to work on for now. I don't have it documented, but if I go to localhost 4000 and then go to API and team member, those are my team members that I have right here, Henry and Bard. Okay, and so we're going to implement this API into our application to replace our existing state. So I've already added Axios to save time. I'm going to start up my application again. And we're going to get to work on integrating this API with our application that we've Some might call it stubbing, some might call it hard coding, because your backend person probably isn't done with most or any of the API by the time you start writing your code. So for now, you can use hard-coded things. And then when you're done, this is a great process of actually integrating the API and the operations that it provides. And we'll see how this in some ways simplifies our application, because I don't have to be as judicious with the way I'm handling state. So let us go ahead and import Axios from Axios. Whew, spelling. Spelling is hard. Okay. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove my existing users from this array. I want to keep it as an array because I try to map over it later and do all my array operations, but for now it's going to be an empty array, and then I'm going to go get my data from my API. Whenever we want to make side effects, like API requests, things that we want to run sometimes, not every time we refresh this component, not every time we re-render this component, but every time something special occurs, we are going to use useEffect. So I'm going to do that here. I'm going to do useEffect. I'm going to give it a callback where my request is going to live. And right now, I'm just going to have it run on the first time we mount this component. So now I am going to write my request. We do that with Axios and HTTP localhost //localhost :4000 /API /team member. I'm sorry, this needs to be a get. Axios.get this API. Then I'm going to get my response, and I'm going to console log it so I can see what it is. Your backend devs will not always have the ability to produce outstanding documentation because they're pretty crunched on time too. So make sure to be console logging this data. We'll see that I get all of my statusy stuff, but inside of the data key, I get my data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set that to be my people state. So I'm going to call setPeople, give it res.data, and now what we're going to see happen is that pops up after a second. We have successfully integrated our API into our previously hard-coded application. Rosa asked a good question, which is backticks around this API URL. This is just a string. In JavaScript, we can mark strings in three ways: double quotes, single quotes, backticks, and probably other ones. Double quotes and single quotes are effectively the same, but they allow us to use the other one inside of there without the string getting confused on where it starts and ends. The advantage of backticks is we can use both of our literal quotes in there, but also we can write multi-line strings. You can't do that with these. This gives you an error. But with backticks, you can have new lines in them. And we can also use template strings, which is something I am going to do when we get to the point where we want to use dynamic routes, like we did with the movies project, where we wanted to get a specific movie. So for now, I can just put that in there, and it works. So now let's get the add people working. So when we go here and we do this, it appears to work because what I've done is I have this add person function that adds the person to my state array of people. But that's not good enough because the API server has no idea that I've added a new person. And here's one of the advantages we see again that I cannot repeat enough of why it's good to make our components dumb. Because the form component, if you remember from last week, we just give it this add person function to run when it submits a person. Does it know how that interacts with state? Nope. Does it know that we're now changing that to interact with the API? Not at all. That's Wonderful. That's really great for us, because now we can make this change and we literally don't have to touch anything in form. It is none the wiser. So instead of just calling this set people thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this data to my API. I'm going to do axios.post, post for when we're creating data, localhost 4000, API team member, and then this is actually going to take a second argument, and this is going to be the data that I want to send to my server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send it that person object, and that will add the person to the API. I also want to console log what I get back. So we're going to get a response back from the server. I'm going to console log the response. So now, whenever I submit a person with my form, I'm going to post it. I'm going to send it to this API URL. I'm going to ask it to add the person object to it. This also alleviates my need to make IDs, because the server's going to do that for me. So that's nice. Let's see what happens. I'm going to add a person. Test email something. I don't think I actually implemented roles on the API. So we don't see any changes, but let's check our console. If we go in here, we're going to see this response object from the server. Our status code has changed. Instead of being 200, it is now 201. And we can look up what those mean. I thought I had this open. Yes, I do. So there's a bunch of HTTP status codes. You may have seen some of them before, like 404 not found, the error message you get when you try to visit a website that, doesn't exist. 200s are successful ones. 200 means great. 201 means content was created. 204 means we did whatever you asked, but there's no relevant data for us to return, so all we're doing is returning the status code. Those are going to be the main successful ones that you see. And then there's also errors. So 400 means generally you did something wrong. You tried to request something that didn't exist. You're not allowed to do that. Your request was malformed. 500 means the server goofed up. So let's look back at our application. So we're getting this status code 201, so that means it was successful and it created my data. And if I look inside, my server has actually decided to return to me the data that got added to the server. That's great. That's great. So what I could do is I could add this to my stateful object. So let's go ahead and do that. So now that I've got that data that I added, I can call setPeople, and I'm going to give it people, but with my new person added on to the end. So now we see when we refresh the page, this person shows up because the API is now returning it in the GET request. But now when I add a person, that person gets added onto my state, as well as getting added onto my API. There's a danger in doing it this way, because what if my request wasn't successful? Well, I've already gone ahead and assumed that it was. So I'm gonna have to, do some stuff there, and that can be handled inside of then and catch, because I'm only doing this if I get the response back. So I need to have a catch here that maybe displays an error message to the user to let them know that this didn't go through. But this is the general way we interact with the API. We could also, instead of doing this manually, we could just fire off a whole new GET request to get all of the team members and then reset our data to be that. That's a little bit wasteful, but if you're trying to save time, you can just always make sure you get the exact updated data you need by doing that. So, any questions with this so far? No? We all feel good about our advanced requests? Put is going to be very similar. I'll show you how to do that when we do editing. And delete is pretty much get, but we delete it. So I want to talk a little bit about how I prefer to organize this. So as far as organizing React app goes, there's a lot of different ways to do it. I believe the official line from Dan Abramoff on the React team on how to organize React applications is to move files around until it feels right. There's no one right way or one wrong way. So far we've been, just using this components directory, but now we're starting to have these things that represent entire pages. They're more than just a single function component. When we do routing, we're rendering this component that is an entire page inside of our application. We generally refer to these as views or scenes or pages or something to delineate them from our reusable components like form. My preferred way of organizing React applications is from this Medium article. And you don't have to follow this at all or follow this rigorously, but here is kind of the first approach for organizing a React application. Inside of source, we have our components, like we've been doing before. We have our containers, which is what I guess they're calling our views, our pages, our scenes, and then any images we need, styles, other code. I prefer this kind of layout, which looks immediately more complicated. But the idea is that we define our scenes, like home, like sign in, like whatever, and those have stuff that are local to them. They have their own components, because sometimes we're going to write a component we use on one page, and we don't need it anywhere else, so we don't need that cluttering up a general purpose components directory. So we make our own components for home. But we're also going to have a general purpose components directory for ones like buttons and notifications and things that get shared between different scenes. Scenes might have other scenes that are dependent on them, like our authentication pages might render login and register, and we don't need to do that anywhere else, so we put that under this scene. And those can have their own components specific to them, but they can also have shared components, and so we can put them up here, we can put them up here if they use it outside of other scenes. But this, at least in my mind, helps logically separate where all these things end up, and I like how it helps me structure my code. As far as sharing code that isn't components, that's what I want to do when interacting with my API. Because I don't want to have to hard code this URL everywhere in my project. Because also, this localhost 4000, that's not the API we're going to use when backend deploys the service to the internet. So I don't want to write logic to choose the correct API to use at every occurrence. I want to localize this. That's a great place to write a function. So what we could do is inside of source, we could create a new directory, call it whatever we want, util, API, anything. Naming stuff is hard. This system tends to call this a service. So I'd create a services directory, and this would contain all code, all logic that isn't directly related to rendering components. I'd create another folder called, am I in the right place? I am. I create another folder called API, and then in here I would create my file. I'm going to call it index.js because I want to show you a neat trick. And then I'm going to import Axios from Axios. And what I can do is I can define and export a variety of functions that do the things that I want to do. So I can make a function, and let's call it get team members. Is it getting mad at me? Okay, that's fine. And what I can do is I can now save my API into a variable. And so this will allow me the ability to use logic to change it. So I can call this API URL HTTP localhost 4000 API. So we're going to have multiple endpoints. And then in here I can make my Axios request. Axios.get. I'm going to use backticks because I have my API URL and I want to add team member onto the back of it. I'm actually going to get rid of this backslash and put it here just because that looks less weird. And now we've abstracted this. And it's totally fine. This might look a bit weird to see me returning this Axios request, but this, when I call it, it just returns a promise. So instead of using Axios.get here, I can call my getTeamMembers function, and that's going to work. So then let's import this in here. I can import this named function, getTeamMembers, from, in this case, it's going to be /services API, and we're done. You might be weirded out because I didn't do index.js here, and you're absolutely allowed to do this. But if you try to import a directory within, this import syntax, it will look for a file called index.js in that directory. And that's a very common way to write React components so that we don't have to put JS here. I can just import a directory called CRUD, and whatever we have decided to split it up inside of there, it doesn't matter. It's just going to go and look for index.js and do it that way. Neither way is better. This is just one way to do it, and I might as well show you while I got you. So then now I can just replace this request with a call to get team members. And if we go back here, it's worked perfectly. And now this really isn't aware of where our API is or even what kind of request we're making. We've abstracted this. We can do the same for this add person. So I can do the same thing. Add team member. I can take in a person as an argument, and I'm just going to steal this. Oop. Well, that doesn't like that at all. Let's copy that again. I'm going to return this post request. I'm going to change this to be backticks, my API URL, /team member, and I'm going to give it the person I'm getting as an argument. And now I can import add team member. And instead of using my post directly, I can call, let me comment that out actually. I can call add team member and give that my person. And that's also going to work just fine. We might run into places where the names start to conflict, right? Where like add team member is, maybe the same as a function I wrote here. I called this add person, but what if I had called it add team member? Things start falling apart. There's a couple solutions. We can rename these things with the as syntax. We could prefix them with a name like API, or we could write it the same way Axios does. You know how we do Axios.get, Axios.whatever? I could make an object called API and give it keys, get team members, and give that the function get team members. And the same thing with add team member, add team member, and now I can export default API, and instead of importing these individually, I'll just get that API object, and then I can call API.getTeamMembers and API.addTeamMembers. And I didn't save this file. And there we go. And that also works. So that's a quick little way to kind of get what we might call in other languages name spacing, so we don't run into conflicts with the way we're naming all these things. Any questions with this so far? No? That was all good? Come on, there's got to be some questions. This is all new stuff. Alright, I see some people typing. While they're typing, I'll show you one other neat trick. I don't actually have to write both sides of this key value pair. If I have a variable and I give it directly to a new object, it will automatically make a key called getTeamMembers and set its value equal to the variable getTeamMembers. Same thing with addTeamMember. This is also totally valid syntax. Pretty neat. Pretty neat. Just saves you some typing in the future. Rosa, you learned another way where you add a template literal in the API. Could you share what you mean? And I'll go ahead and rig up the put method, because this can also simplify our logic here. One of the hardest parts of edit person was when we render this route, we had to give it the initial data for that person. But now I can just get that from my API. I'm going to add a new function called getTeamMember. And this is going to take an ID. And what we're going to do is we're going to add that to the end of the route. Because we're going to access individual team members by, instead of doing API team member, I see Henry has an ID of 1. If I do /1, just like the movies, I get exactly their information. Oh, okay, yes, I'll be touching on environment variables in just a minute. So what we can do is we can actually remove this initial person stuff and just go and get the data inside of the form and display the person that way, which is pretty cool. Right now my application isn't super well set up for that, so let me think about how I want to demo this, because I still don't have a ton of prep time on these. So right now we're getting that out of here. I built my form component reusably. I mean, we can make our form a little bit dumber. How do I want to do this? So this is probably where I would write another component. And I would keep form dumb. I would keep it taking this initial person data. And I would write a new component that's going to wrap and render form, and also keep track of getting in the data for my API. So I'm just going to do that right in this file for simplicity's sake. So I'm going to call it edit form. That's going to take in props. What this is going to do is it is going to render the form component with all of the good stuff that it needs. Formatting. Okay. So we're going to rip out this people.find. Instead, we're going to get data from our API. We're also going to need to get this edit person function from our app. Or in this case, we can probably just write this directly inside of our edit form. Our app doesn't really need to be fully aware of what's happening here. So, no, I'm actually going to leave this an app, because I want to, when this edit has finished triggering, to update the people that I have in my state. I could do this by triggering this get again, or I can update my state directly, which is the way we're going to have this work. So we're going to need to get this edit person out of props. I prefer to destructure it, so I'm going to grab edit person out of my props object. And then we're going to have to get the initial person. One other prop that I'm going to need is the ID of the person that I want. And I can use this to create a stateful variable, const initial person, and set initial person equal to use state, and I'm going to make this null to start off with. Then I'm going to trigger use effect, which is going to make the request to my API, and I'm going to have this fire whenever the ID changes. We're going to see I use this ID variable inside of my use effect callback, so that means I need to put it in the dependency array. But this also makes sense because I want this use effect to happen whenever the ID changes, whenever I need to get a new person. So then I'm going to call api.get team member. I'm going to give that the ID so it can go out and perform the get and the appropriate resource. Then I want to get the response, and I'm going to set the initial person to be the team member. So I'm going to give it res.data, which the API is going to give me back an object there that is that specific team member's data, and then now I can give this on down to my form as a prop. So nothing's changed because we haven't actually rendered this component. We haven't used it anywhere. I'm going to have it replace the route that we're rendering when we edit things. So instead of being form, this is going to be edit form. I'll still give it all these props. The initial person is going to be handled within edit form. We do want to give it this edit person and this button text. So let me make sure to pass that one down as well. So let me grab button text, and then I will give it button text. Notice that I'm still doing ... props here. What this allows me to do is pass down any other props I haven't explicitly mentioned, like history, match, location, all of those things. And if, in some case, there is a prop called button text, and I'm setting its value differently here, it will take the one further down. It will take the one farther to the right. This is a little trick to just make sure it gets all the props it needs, but then also specify any additional props that I want. Can you go over ... prop next to the form component in app.js again? Yes. So when we're passing props, we write these key value pairs. Like button text is equal to button text, which is basically the same way that we write objects. That's how I write an object. So we can use this spread operator, which strips off the outer brackets around any of our data structures, like an object or an array, and it will do this. This still has the curly braces around it because that's our syntax for getting JSX to run JavaScript. So if I did this, if I put another pair of angle brackets around here, I'd be creating a copy of props. But instead what I'm doing with a single pair of curly braces is I'm spreading the props object. So I'm removing the curly braces around it. And what that leaves me with is a bunch of key value pairs, like button text colon button text, which is basically the exact same as the way we write props. And React will actually see those values as props. So this is a way for me to turn an object full of key value pairs into a bunch of props, which are also key value pairs. So we spread our object upwards into key value pairs that are used as properties. Does that clear up your confusion, or is it still not entirely understandable. Okay, great. So now, when I edit person, we're going to get an error. First, I didn't actually save this file. That's not the error that I had expected. So let's go back here, and let's edit this. Oh, I forgot to add it to my object. So adding get team member to that object. Yay, and then I add a person. But nothing actually shows up. Nothing shows up. Well, is my API request not working? Let's console log it. Let's see. Oop, request failed with status code 404. That is not what I expected my error to be. Let's see. No, why is that? Let's see, I'm doing team member ID. Let's console log this ID. Oh, here's why. Made a goof here. Sorry I didn't plan this out super well. So this ID, I mysteriously said that I was getting it in from props, and I never actually defined it. I'm actually going to get this from the match object that we're getting from the route, and then I'm going to define a variable called the ID that is match.params.id. So that way we're getting the ID from the routing. So then now, if I go home and I edit, let's check and see what our console says. Aha. So now we're actually getting data back, and it's correct. It is the test person that I just clicked on to edit. But it's not showing up in our form. Does anyone know why? This is really subtle. Let me bring up the form component. Really subtle here. Any ideas? I'll narrow it down. It has to do with where we're setting the initial person. So what has happened here is when edit form first goes through, the initial person is going to be null. So we set the initial value of state to be the blank one, because there is no initial person. And when our get request finishes, we'll be now giving it an initial person that has some value. But it doesn't matter, it's too late. We've already set the initial value of our state. There's two ways of fixing this. We could do a use effect inside of form so that when initial person changes, it will set the person to be whatever that new value of initial person is, or we can do some conditional rendering up here. That's why I set this to be null initially. Because what I can do is I can say if initial person is null, I'm going to actually return a div that says loading. So this way, when initial person comes back from our API, we'll try to render this form for the first time, and it'll actually show up. And this just helps keep my form dumb. There we go. Now that actually shows up in the form. So then we can also modify edit person to make use of the put request. So let's see where I defined edit person. We can do all of this just fine and keep it the way it is to update our state, but we can also send this off in a put request. And so if I open my API, I have a function called edit team member. And this is going to make a put request. Put is when we change data. This is not only going to need an object of the person that we want to change, but we're also going to need to tell the API which person we want to change. So we're going to have to give this an ID as well. And I'll add that to this, edit team member. Now I can use that in here. So I'm going to call API.edit team member. I'm going to give it the ID of the person, which I can get out of newPerson.id. Then I can also give it that newPerson object. Then, only if I'm successful, I can get the response, which should contain the updated person in it. And I can do all of this stuff here. And let's see if this works. So let me change their name to a new name. Submit person is not a function. What did I do wrong? Oh, I forgot to pass edit person as a prop to edit form. There we go. A new name. We click edit person, and then this person now has a new name. If I refresh my page, the new name persists because we actually went and gave that to our API. I know this was very complicated. I know you probably have a lot of questions. I'm going to have to stop this from here because I have to go into a meeting, but you have all week to kind of learn and practice this. Your backend person has been through this. They're there to help you as well. And we'll talk more about APIs the more we get into the week and the more we need to interact with them. So, thank you all so much for coming. Please put any questions in the Web21 channel and I will answer them as I am able. And I'll also restart this after the meeting to go over anything else that I missed. So, I'll see you all later.